So we're going to have Sir Colin Humphreys today, and I'll tell you a bit about him in a minute. But he'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. Well, questions and answers from him, I hope. And then there'll be refreshments outside, free refreshments, just to sit and stand and chat with people a bit more. You may have noticed these flyers on the seats as you came in, so do take those away. There's a general description of what the Faraday Institute is doing at the moment. There's also an advert for the summer course, which we run for 1 week in the first week of July. Bring in lots of outside speakers, and it's a really good time. And it's science, faith, and human flourishing this time. And there is still some space, I'm told, if you want to sign up. But time is passing very quickly. But if you want to do that, look on the Faraday website, and you'll find the details there. The other thing is that we do have monthly newsletters. It's only once a month, just telling you what's coming up. If you want to be put on the mailing list for that, there's a clipboard outside. Just put your email address on that. I'm told there isn't a fire test scheduled, although there is actually a fire going on just around the corner. But there isn't a fire test scheduled here today, so if you hear the fire alarm, it's for real. And there are exits at the back, the one you came in and one the other side. Oh, there's one there as well, so there's 3 exits. So that's all the normal stuff. Let me tell you about Colin Humphreys. Well, I'm not going to tell you all the prizes and honours he's won, because we'd be here half the evening, but very many, I can tell you. And he's been director of all kinds of institutes, but at the moment he's director of in the Department of Material Sciences and Metallurgy here in Cambridge, and he's also director of the Aegstron Centre for Gallium Nitride. Now, I mention that because one of the great things he's done was find how to make LEDs coloured, and also different shades of white, I think. And he was telling me earlier that just changing all those traffic lights that you get annoyed about from normal bulbs to LEDs saves a whole power station. And in fact, it's thought that if you change all the LEDs in your lamps at home and so on, which is rapidly happening, it will save about 10 power stations. So he's had a huge impact on many people's lives, not to say, least of all, on climate change. He also was part of inventing memory metals. These are the things that are really useful to us, because if you have them in your glasses and you sit on your glasses and bend them, when you stand up again, they'll go back to the original shape, and various other things as well. So he's done great things, which are really fascinating. But tonight he's going to talk about science and the reliability of the Bible, and I really look forward to this. So, Colin, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for that introduction. It's great to see so many people here, and it's a pleasure to talk on this topic. Let's use this clicker. So, does it matter if the Bible's reliable? Well, Christianity and Judaism, they're not some sort of vague set of beliefs. They're based on historical beliefs, and those historical beliefs largely come from the Bible. So they do have their roots in history, but we should ask the question, is the Bible reliable? Is this reliable history? So some people think the Old Testament's purely fiction, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Some say a fictional matrix, some history embedded in it. Others say major factual historical content. So we'll have a look at that. And if we come to the New Testament, then the character of Jesus, his life, death, resurrection, what he said, can only really be known from the New Testament records. But are they reliable? So how do we know that Jesus really did say these things? And of course, this is all very hard to prove, but I'm going to take perhaps a different approach from many people. I'm going to look at 3 really difficult biblical stories, all right? Stories which just don't seem as if they possibly could be true. And I'm trying to look at this without bias, but just let's look at the evidence. Let's take a scientific approach. When Einstein proposed his general theory of relativity, I think, was it 1916, he didn't live that long. I think that's probably not the right day. I think that it wasn't believed for 2 or 3 years until experimental evidence started to come in, and then the evidence just fitted this theory and it became widely believed. So let's look at the evidence. And I've taken these three stories in the Bible, one from the book of Genesis, the story of Joshua, one from the book of Joshua itself, where the sun apparently stood still, and one from Matthew's Gospel about the Star of Bethlehem. And most scholars, even most biblical scholars, do question whether these were factual historical events. So we'll look at the evidence, and my sort of reasoning is, if we can show that these difficult stories are reliable, and we'll see if we can or not, and there are other stories, if we can show they're reliable, then it increases your expectations that the less difficult stories are reliable as well. Right? So it's a bit like science. If the difficult things can be explained by a scientific theory, then the simpler things, you have some confidence they can be explained as well. So this is the story of Joseph. It's in the book of Genesis. It occupies Genesis chapters 30 to 50, and that's 40% of the whole book of Genesis is focused just on the story of Joseph. By comparison, the creation of the universe, all the animals and man, is Genesis chapter 1, right? So this story of Joseph, really important to the writer of Genesis. And some of you will be familiar with this, others won't, so I'm going to paraphrase this, and I'm missing out all sorts of detail because, you know, if we went through these 20 chapters, it would take a very long time. So this is my paraphrase of some of the main points of the story. So Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob. He was not the firstborn, and so this is unusual to start with because not only in ancient Israel but throughout the Middle East, the firstborn sons were just nearly always favoured. They were given double portions of food, for example. And his father gave him what's called a coat of many colours. The Hebrew actually means a richly ornamented robe, and the implications are this was really expensive, right? It's the most expensive dyes, the most expensive materials. And his brothers understandably were jealous. And less understandably, perhaps, they were really, really jealous, and they sold him as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. So he was taken to Egypt, and he was sold to a person called Potiphar. And my guess is that Joseph was a very handsome man because Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him several times. Joseph said no several times. His wife then became very angry and said Joseph had tried to seduce her. So Joseph was then thrown into prison. And while he was in prison, he met the cupbearer of the Pharaoh. And the cupbearer was in prison for some rather minor misdemeanor. And the cupbearer had a dream which Joseph interpreted. And then the cupbearer was released sometime after that. And Pharaoh had a dream. And it was a rather unusual dream. Pharaoh dreamt that he was looking at the River Nile, and 7 cows came out, and these very fat, plump cows, and they were followed by 7 very thin cows. And Pharaoh called together all the wise men in Egypt to interpret this dream, and they no doubt gave him interpretations which he didn't believe, didn't seem plausible. And then this cupbearer went to Pharaoh and said, "Oh, while I was in prison, I had a dream which this man Joseph interpreted, and it all came true, so why don't you talk to Joseph?" So Pharaoh brought Joseph out of prison and told Joseph his dream, and Joseph interpreted it. And he said, look, these 7 fat cows mean 7 years of really good harvest, and the 7 thin cows mean 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh thought this was the most plausible explanation of the dream. So he said to Pharaoh, well, what shall we do? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, what shall we do? Joseph said, build barns and fill them with grain when the harvest is plentiful. And then when you have 7 years of famine, you'll have grain in these barns to feed the people of Israel. So Pharaoh did this, and he put Joseph in charge of his palace and the second in command over all of Egypt. And then this dream was fulfilled. The interpretation was fulfilled. There were 7 years of plentiful harvest, then 7 years of famine. And just go into the next bit of the story of Joseph. So Joseph collected this grain in huge barns in the 7 years of plenty. When it was the famine, Egypt had food, but the neighbouring lands did not, because the famine was not just in Egypt, but in the neighbouring lands. So other countries came to buy food from Joseph in Egypt. And Joseph's father Jacob sent 10 of Joseph's brothers to Egypt to buy food. Jacob had no idea that Joseph was there. And I'm cutting a long story short now, but it ends up with Pharaoh telling Joseph to invite all of his family to live in Egypt. So this is all 70 of Jacob's family came to live in Egypt. They settled in Egypt. And this story is actually of some theological significance because, according to Genesis, this is how the ancient Israelites came to be in Egypt. And of course, if there was an exodus from Egypt, the Israelites had to be there in the first place, and so this is how they got there. And so it's relevant to the Exodus story as well, which a number of scholars doubt. So this is if they weren't in Egypt, then this may be a reason to doubt the Exodus story as well. So the question is this story history? These are two very distinguished academics, and this is what they say. This is what Redford said in his book, Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times. The Joseph story shows all the hallmarks of a composition rather than a record. And then Alstrom, in his book, The History of Ancient Palestine, is somewhat stronger. The Joseph story is not history, just as, for instance, Shakespeare wrote about Richard III, a biblical writer could compose a story about Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. So why do scholars take this belief that the story is really not believable? Well, it's for what apparently are really quite good reasons. So this is some of them. One reason is they say it is inconceivable that an Egyptian pharaoh would appoint a foreigner to be his deputy. And that is clearly a rather strong argument. It's actually an argument I believe in. I think it is inconceivable that an Egyptian pharaoh would appoint a foreigner to be his deputy. The Egyptians are just such a proud race. The next reason is they say this story was written about 1,000 years after the supposed event. And it's so detailed, it cannot be accurate. It must be made up. And they didn't have the internet there. So even today, writing something detailed about 1,000 years ago, even with the internet, would be quite difficult. But without the internet, would be virtually impossible. So that again seems to be a good reason. And then they say Egypt owed its prosperity to the regularity of the flooding of the Nile. So a 7-year famine in Egypt is improbable. So those are some of the reasons the story is doubted. And many Christians just ignore these criticisms, although I think they are actually very valid and at first sight good criticism. So I think we should really take them seriously and engage with them and just really look at the evidence, because a lot of these statements are not that evidence-based, as we shall see. So that's how I look at this aside. So if Joseph is historical, then when did he live? And the chairman and myself, some years ago, he's probably forgotten, wrote a paper called The Eruption of Santorini and the Date of Historicity of Joseph, which was published in Science and Christian Belief and also published, I think, in Geology Today. And we also said that a 7-year famine in Egypt was unusual because of the regularity of the flooding of the Nile. So what's the evidence of this? Well, we do have some evidence of the Nile flooding, because the Egyptians had a very sensible taxation system. And this taxation system was based on the flooding of the Nile. So the priests of the temples, they constructed Nilometers, and I've been to Egypt and seen those, they're still here today, along the banks of the Nile. And they were like, water measuring containers. And when the Nile flooded, and so in the Nilometers the water level was high, their taxes were high. They said the farmers, they had lots of their land would have been, irrigated, so they would have lots of crops so they could pay high taxes. And when the Nile on occasion didn't flood, then they sort of almost abolished the taxes for that year. So it's a very sensible subject of way of taxing people. And from these records, we can see that the Nile failed to really flood strongly about 1 year in 10, but 9 years in 10 it really did flood. So if you just take some rather simple statistics, then if it didn't flood for 1 year in 10, then the chance of it not flooding for 2 consecutive years was probably 1 in 100, 3 consecutive years, 1 in 1,000, 7 consecutive years, 1 in about 10 million. So it really is highly unlikely that the Nile didn't flood this time. And also we have no records of a 7-year famine. So what we did in our paper was to look at another reason. We said this is highly unlikely that the Nile not flooding. We looked at another reason for a famine, and what can cause a famine is a massive volcanic eruption. And that's due to toxic volcanic gases. The Earth's temperature is often lowered, but these, and darkness is often with these big volcanic eruptions, huge dust clouds thrown up into the atmosphere, the sky is darkened, the temperature is lowered, and acid rain falls, which destroys the seed. And you can see the effects of this in tree rings, because tree rings, if there's a famine, tree rings, but it's true if there's famine, if there's a volcanic eruption, the tree rings narrow, and so this is a record of volcanic eruptions, and it's an absolute record because you get tree rings annually, and they're just very, very thin when you have famines. And so we know by counting tree rings, and you can match the rings of living and dead trees, so you can go back in time, quite a long way. There was a massive volcanic eruption in 1628 BC. And in our paper, we attribute this to Santorini. I think Bob's the expert on volcanoes. It's probably fair to say people are not agreed on which volcano this is that caused this eruption. And we know there was an eruption then because of the tree rings. We also know from ice cores that there was a volcanic eruption then. It might have been Santorini, it might have been a different volcano, we don't know. But there was a major famine around most of the world at that time. And so we can say that if we need a reason for a famine that lasted, say, around 7 years, then this is plausible, and it's probably the main plausible mechanism. So let's try placing Joseph at this time. That is in 1628 BC. And also, the famine was in neighbouring countries, the book of Genesis says. So, it couldn't have been because the Nile didn't flood it, because the neighbouring countries were affected by this famine. So that's interesting if we put the famine then, when we know there's a massive volcanic eruption, because for about 100 years, and this is at the bottom here, this was at a time of what are called the Hyksos kings of Egypt, who reigned from there were 6 kings in this period of time. And the Hyksos kings were foreign kings. So they were conquered by these foreign kings, hated by the Egyptians. The Egyptians they tried to destroy all records of them afterwards, so we have very few records. We do know the names of these kings. They were foreign kings. So this is rather interesting. If this is true, this eruption, it gives you an absolute date for the famine in Egypt at the time of Joseph. And it is totally plausible, as we say at the bottom, that if the Hyksos kings were reigning, they would appoint a deputy as a non-Egyptian. In fact, it's highly unlikely the Hyksos kings ever appointed an Egyptian as their deputy. So we can now see that argument becomes rather slender, and we have this date of the eruption coinciding with this period of Hyksos kings starts to tell us a consistent story. Dating the Genesis text, and I'm going to spend a little time on this because I think there's often a lot of misunderstandings about dating the text. So how do we date ancient texts? And the main method is to compare the language of ancient texts with other literature whose dates you know. And then if the language is similar, you can date the ancient text. And this is really difficult for ancient biblical texts because there are very few texts outside the Old Testament at that sort of time period. But with the evidence we have, then a scholar who I trust a lot is Alan Millard, who's the Emeritus Professor of Ancient Hebrew and Semitic Languages at Liverpool University. He says the date of the Hebrew of the Genesis text is between 700 and 600 BC. Other scholars will say later than this, but it's unlikely to be earlier than this from the language dating. So this would be, if we've dated Joseph to 1628 BC, and the Genesis texts have a language of 700 to 600 BC, it is indeed 1,000 years after the events recorded. So this seems to be a plausible argument for these texts really not being very accurate. But what we have to remember, and what lots of people forget, is what we've just done is to date the language of the text, not when the texts were originally written. And what we have is scribal copies of texts. We have probably, I think it may be true to say with no book of the Bible do we actually have the original text. They're all copies of the text. And what happened, as Kenneth Kitchen said, and Kenneth Kitchen is a great Egyptologist, he writes in his book called On the Reliability of the Old Testament, consider Moses writing on papyrus, skins, etc. Copies of originals will be recopied, modernizing outdated grammatical forms and spellings, a process universal in the ancient Near East. Experienced scribes were able to transmit very accurate copies of work for centuries. So what he's saying is, not just Hebrew literature, but Egyptian literature and Babylonian literature, scribes would copy very, very accurately, but they would update the language and update the grammar. And this is just what happens today with our Bibles, of course. Most people here will read, if they read the Bible, will read modern translations of the Bible, which are updated. So they try to be very accurate translations, but they update the language into modern English. And that's what scribes did when they copied. So although the earliest texts we have a language datable to 700, 600 BC, the original texts are lost, and they may be much older. I just want to emphasize this a little more. So at home I've got a book which says William Shakespeare, The Complete Works is on the cover. And if I open that book, it says inside, Tudor edition, first published 1951. And so some people make this same sort of mistake with biblical texts. So we know Shakespeare did not write them in 1951. So his writings have been edited in this edition. How do we know when Shakespeare wrote his books, wrote his plays and so on? Well, we can date the language he used by other known language at the time, or we can date Shakespeare himself, if we believe Shakespeare wrote it, of course. And just to emphasize a bit more, let's say you're working in an ancient library, you discover a text of Genesis. Library was built in 3 BC. The Genesis text you can date to 700 BC. How do you know what date it was? And you just don't know. The text may be very ancient. And so at that stage, we seem to be stuck, and we need more evidence to say what the date of the text is. But amazingly, I think we do have more evidence, which actually comes from a remarkable analysis by Kenneth Kitchen of ancient texts. And Kenneth Kitchen has looked at the earliest sources, and for a given century, the price of slaves was the same in these neighbouring countries, because I presume they traded slaves, which kept the price the same across countries. So, and we have records in different literature, in Babylonian literature, Egyptian literature, Hebrew literature, of the price of slaves. And it's subject to inflation, right? So inflation affects nearly the cost of nearly everything. So, you know, the cost of chips goes up with inflation, right? If they're potato chips, they're silicon chips, it's unusual, they come down. So price of everything goes up, price of bread goes up. What Kenneth Kitchen found is that in this time period, 1700, 1600 BC, the price of slaves was 20 shekels of silver. 1400 to 1300 BC, it was 30 shekels of silver. 700 BC, 50 shekels of silver. 400 BC, 100 shekels of silver. The text says Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver. So if this was a composition in, say, 700 BC, which is the language of the time that was used, then the author, how would they know what the price was in the time period they were allegedly writing about? So, to me, the most, Occam's razor, if you like, that the most plausible interpretation of this piece of evidence is that the literature actually may date back to 1700 to 1600 BC, because that is when the price of a slave was 20 shekels of silver. And it may have been written down then, it may be oral tradition or written tradition, but it's just been faithfully transmitted, except when the scribes copied it, they would update the language and correct spellings. So we have, I think, a consistent story that Joseph lived in that time period. If it had been invented in 700 BC, the story, 50 shekels would have been used. So this does, I suggest the original story will date back to 1700, 1600 BC. And then we have really a remarkably consistent story, I think. The only real explanation of a famine for 7 years is a volcanic eruption. We know that tree rings were narrowed in 1628 BC for around 7 years. That was the time of the Hyksos pharaohs, which are foreign pharaohs, when they would appoint a non-Egyptian as their deputy. So the 1628 fits into the Hyksos period, and then Joseph was sold as a slave for 20 shekels of silver, which was the known price of slaves from literature that's been analysed really carefully by Kenneth Kitchen in this period, 1700 to 1600 BC. So I would say the Joseph story actually shows all the hallmarks of being factual and historical, with the original text being faithfully copied by scribes over many centuries who just updated language used, as I said before, like modern biblical translations. And also, if you accept this, then we actually know the date of the Joseph famine and when Joseph lived. So let's move on now to another story, and this is the sun standing still. I'll just read this out to you. It's just in 2 or 3 verses in the book of Joshua. On the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped. until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in mid-heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded a human voice, for the Lord fought for Israel. So this just shows you a map of ancient Israel. We know now, beyond reasonable doubt, I think, where these places were, these ancient places, but Israel had their base camp at a place called Gilgal, and this is where the speech was made from, and this is where Gibeon is and Ajalon, and they chased the Amorites along this track, and they ended up here in the evening time. They started actually when it was night. They did a surprise nighttime attack on the Amorites, and this is all in the land of Canaan, which is now called Israel and Palestine. So that's the route taken when the Israelites were in Canaan. So did God really make the sun stand still? And this really is one of the most curious passages in the Bible. And when I give talks on science religion, I'm asked this question about 1 Talk in 3. What happened when the sun stood still? And I've always said, I'm sorry, I do not know. And one day I thought, I should really look into this, and let's see what the Hebrew actually says, which is always a good idea. So the sun stood still is the translation. The sun stood still, the Hebrew word is dom, and moon stopped, Hebrew word is amad, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. There's been no day like it before or since. This is the New Revised Standard Version. All biblical versions say much the same thing. So the King James Version started with this sort of translation, and all other versions that I've looked at quite a lot, just give the wording is not exactly the same, but they all say the sun stood still and the moon stopped. So there's a unanimity amongst biblical translators that this is the correct translation. I was rather interested to see that Hebrew word dom usually means silent, not usually translated silent, but it's also translated dumb or still. So this is my thought process. I'll tell you what it is when I was looking at this problem. So what does it mean for the sun to be silent? What does it mean for us to be silent? So if we're silent, we stop uttering, all right? We stop speaking. So if the sun's silent, then it stops doing what it normally does. It stops shining. So I immediately thought, being a scientist, could this be referring to a solar eclipse? And I contacted Alan Miller. I'll come to this one. The problem with interpretation is this. So, okay. I was getting sidetracked. Let me go into why is this a problem? Why is the sun stopping a problem? So if you're a believer in a God, then you believe that God can do anything. Most people believe that if they believe in a God. But the key question you have to ask with these sorts of passages is not what could God do, but what did God do? So we're trying to look for evidence of what really happened. And so why this is difficult scientifically, if the sun stops, then it means, if the sun appears to be going around the earth, rises in the east and sets in the west, if it suddenly stops, well, we actually know now that the sun doesn't rise in the east and goes to it. That's what we see it do, but actually it's because the earth is spinning on its axis, right? So the sun's not going around the earth like this. The earth's spinning on its axis once every 24 hours. And so if the sun stops, then what's really happening scientifically is the earth stops rotating on its axis. The earth rotates once every 24 hours, and you may find this remarkable if you're not a scientist. A person on the equator is actually traveling at 1,000 miles an hour, and we're not on the equator, a bit north of that, and we're rotating at about 500 miles an hour. So all of us in this room, you're all rotating at 500 miles an hour. And the room's rotating that speed, and everyone's rotating that speed. But it is a remarkable fact that that is the case. And so what happens if the Earth suddenly stops rotating? So let's say, thank you, yes, that's right. So let's say you're travelling on a roof rack of a car for some reason, and the car's very full, and the Earth suddenly stops, and the car suddenly stops, and you're just thrown forwards, right? So let's say you're on a motorway, on top of a car for some reason, and the car stops, and you're thrown forward at 70 miles an hour. And so if people were thrown forward at 500 miles an hour, there'd just be total devastation and around the Earth. So we'd fly through the air, massive tsunamis, there'd be huge tsunamis as well, huge destruction. We have no evidence of such destruction of anywhere in the earth. So this is why the sun stopping is extremely unlikely scientifically. It's a real problem for scientists. And that's why I've looked at a number of commentaries, and even the most conservative commentaries can't believe the story. All right? They all have problems with it. And so virtually all scholars believe the story is a legend or some great exaggeration. So, as I say, what the Hebrew words mean, dom means silent, dumb or still. If the sun is silent, it stops emitting light. Or indeed, if you say the sun stops, all the translators assumed it means the sun stops moving instead of the sun stops shining. So, and then amad is a broader word, means to stop, and again. So, can the sun, in fact, stop shining? So it's an eclipse. So I then contacted Alan Millard, who I've known for many years, and I said to him, is this a reasonable interpretation of this word, dom and amad, that there's an eclipse? And Alan Millard said, it's totally reasonable, but you're not the first to suggest this. This was said 100 years ago. So you people who are scientists here will know this very well, this feeling you discover something new and actually discovered 30 years ago by someone else. And so he said it's discovered by a Princeton University linguist called Robert Wilson. And Robert Wilson went further in what he said. He wrote a paper in which he said that in Babylonian cuneiform texts, these astronomical texts describing eclipses, the word the Babylonians used to describe an eclipse has the same root as this Hebrew word dom. And so he says, and actually Millard said, the sun stood still, he believes, should be translated as the sun was eclipsed. But, Alan Millard said, the evidence doesn't fit. And so I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, well, people have looked into this. So we'll come on to that in a moment. So, and just to note, at a solar eclipse, the sun stops shining, and the moon is also not. At a solar eclipse, the moon is a genuine new moon. It's what's called conjunction, when the moon, earth, and sun are in precise alignment, and so the moon is invisible as well. At a solar eclipse also, for a day or two, a day before and after, it's also invisible. So in any lunar cycle, there's 2 or 3 days when you can't see the moon at all between the old moon and the new moon, and that's when the solar eclipse occurs. So I suggest the best translation of this Hebrew was the sun was eclipsed. But 100 years ago, someone published a paper after Robert Wilson and said, this looks very plausible, but we can't do the calculations, they're just too difficult. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well maybe this is I've given another big talk today, so this on a different subject. This I wasn't expecting this slide. Okay, let's move on to this slide, and we'll come back to that argument in a moment, right? So hold what I've just said in your memory. So this is evidence that the Israelites were in Canaan at the time. So the book of Joshua says they were, and it gives these places in Canaan. We have this extra biblical evidence, which is really useful, called the Meneptah stele. Meneptah was the son of Ramesses II, the famous Egyptian pharaoh, and this stele is a granite block which is now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, so you're going to see it. And the stele says on it at the bottom, this was carved in the 5th year of the reign of Meneptah, and the stele mentions campaigns in Canaan in which Meneptah claims to have defeated the people of Israel amongst a number of others. So Meneptah's actually saying the Israelites were, the people of Israel were in Canaan in his 1st to 5th year, in one of those time periods. So the Israelites must have been in Canaan by the 5th year of Meneptah. So it's nice evidence that the Israelites were in Canaan. And then, when was the 5th year of Meneptah? Well, there's a really nice paper in Science by someone called Ramsey, who's done radiocarbon dating of all this dynasty, Egyptian dynasty 19, and he says that the 1st year of the reign of Meneptah was in 1231 to 1207 BC with a 95% probability. So this is a very probable date range for the 1st year of Meneptah. And so if the Israelites were in Canaan as a people in his first 5 years of Meneptah, then the latest possible date for the Israelites to be in Canaan was, if you take this date, 1207, and subtract 5 years from that, you get 1202 BC. So that's the latest possible date for the Israelites to be in Canaan. And if you look at the text of Joshua, then the Israelites crossed the River Jordan, and they went to Jericho, in the spring of the year they enter Canaan, and then this event, this sun standing still, seems to have been from the text in the autumn or later in that same year. And so the latest possible date for the sun stopping shining in the latest, right, let's say it again. The sun stopped shining in the year they entertained. The latest possible date was 1202 BC. So if you accept this carbon dating, which is done very rigorously, then this is the best date for when the latest possible date for when they enter Canaan. So let's come back now to solar eclipse calculations. And so in 1972, Sawyer published a paper following up the suggestion of this linguist Wilson that Joshua 10 refers to a solar eclipse. And what he did, he calculated the dates of all solar eclipses visible from Gibeon in Canaan between 1500 and 1050 BC. So he had a very broad date range. He said, we don't know when this eclipse may have occurred. Let's give it this very broad date range. And what he found was in this date range, there were only 2 total solar eclipses visible from Canaan, one in 1157 BC, the other in 1131 BC. And the problem with these dates is they're both too late for the latest possible date for Joshua to have entered Canaan, according to Manetta with radiocarbon datings. And so that's why biblical scholars who knew about this solar eclipse interpretation just ruled it out, and it's been forgotten about. Because both dates just are too late for this event to be in a solar eclipse. So I then had a slightly different thought, and that is, in the ancient world, people did not distinguish between total and annular solar eclipses. So in our modern world, we have total eclipses when the sun's completely blotted out apart from a corona around the sun, annular eclipses when the sun's so in an annular eclipse, the moon is again almost blocking out the sun, but its distance from the Earth is slightly different, and so there's just a thin ring of the sun surrounding the black disk of the eclipse. And we also have partial eclipses. In the ancient world, they use the same word for total and annular eclipses. They're both regarded as total, and we know that from Chinese and other records. So I thought, let's do the calculations again, seeing if there was an annular eclipse visible. And again, I chose this broad date range, 1500 to 1050 BC. And there was one and one only eclipse visible from Canaan in that time period. That was on the 30th of October, 1207 BC. And this eclipse passed directly over Canaan. So if this interpretation is accepted, then the eclipse interpretation is accepted, which I think is the best translation of the Hebrew, and it makes sense scientifically. We have a unique solution for Joshua entering Canaan in 1207 BC. And what's interesting is, it turns out that this is, if you look at other literature of eclipses, this would be the oldest datable solar eclipse recorded in any literature. And if you accept the explanation, then you can interpret this puzzling Joshua passage, which suggests it's factual. And then what is interesting is, you can then refine the reign dates of the Egyptian pharaohs, because you can take the dating of Manetta from radiocarbon dating. You can take the data, the fact that Joshua has to be there in the first 5 years of Manetta, and you can get the date ranges of the Egyptian pharaohs, and you get it to an accuracy of plus or minus 2 years. And this is the most accurate dating of the Egyptian pharaohs. At the moment, the Egyptian dating of pharaohs is given with an accuracy of about plus or minus 10 years. So, and we published this paper. I deliberately put it into an astronomy journal to get the astronomy, as it were, peer-reviewed and verified. So it's very recent. It was published, I think, in September 2017 in this journal. So it's quite interesting. If you accept this, then the Bible's actually letting you refine the history of ancient Egypt. So, well, was it a miracle? And what we've done, we've explained the sun stopping, but we've not explained it away. We're just saying this was a mechanism that this was the mechanism used for the sun stopping shining. It was an eclipse, and it was the timing which was remarkable, that just when Joshua was fighting this battle, the eclipse occurred. So it's a sign and wonder, if you like, at just the right time. And it was a normal eclipse, so God didn't tweak any orbits at all. This is an eclipse you can retro-calculate. And so if you, this is very tentative, if you believe this is the interpretation, then and this timing was so remarkable, then I think it must have been prearranged by God before the foundation of the world for this actually to have happened. It was just built in And I suggest that again very tentatively, I suggest that when God created the world, his salvation plan was in place, and there was a fixed framework there, where there certain events were prearranged, like the coming of Moses, probably the coming of Jesus, and these were just pre-planned and prefixed. And then with flexibility, I suggest, within that framework, or else prayer is meaningless if we don't have that sort of flexibility. So I suggest there is flexibility. But this is, quite tentative. But I think that the scientific facts sort of fit this interpretation. Another thing which is interesting is commentators on the book of Joshua, nearly all of them say, it's really, I better get close to the mic, nearly all of them say it's hard to explain the rapid conquest of Canaan by Joshua because it just seems very rapidly swept through the land. But if this eclipse had happened, you can understand that people would have talked about it throughout the land of Canaan. There was this eclipse when Joshua beat the Amorites. And it's a bit like when ISIS swept through Iraq and so on, they were just terrified. People thought God was on their side. There were these terrible warriors, and they would have thought God was on the side of the Israelites as they swept through the land of Canaan. So it may help to explain this rapid conquest of Canaan by Joshua. So I suggest that when the Bible's new translations come out, the sun was eclipsed should at least be a footnote in the Bible, but even better, that should be the main text, and they should put the sun stood still in a footnote. So, because I think that everything is a consistent story. And we have an absolute date for the conquest. If the Exodus, if the period of wilderness wanderings were a literal 40 years, and we don't know that, then the date of the Exodus would be 1247 BC. That is close to the date that Kenneth Kitchen, for other reasons, gives to the Exodus, where he says the date of the Exodus is 1260 to 1250 BC, and we're going to 1247 BC. There are two main dates for the Exodus. Other people will say something like 1640 BC, and this interpretation completely rules out that earlier date for the Exodus. Gosh, okay, I will speed up. Right, the Star of Bethlehem. So this is Rowan Williams. I have a great respect for. He's a great biblical scholar, but he's not a scientist, and this is what he said in this radio interview. The story of the three-ways men is nothing but legend. There was scant evidence for the Magi. The chances of snow falling in Bethlehem were very unlikely. And that third statement is rather curious, because unless I've missed it, the Bible nowhere says that snow was falling in Bethlehem. and if it did, it wouldn't be unlikely, because I've been in Bethlehem when it's been snowing, right? So Bethlehem is below the snow line, and it frequently snows there in winter. But anyway, I don't think that's in the Bible. But let's look at the Magi. And very briefly, there's a lot of evidence for the Magi. So Herodotus tells us Magi originated in Persia in about 500 BC, and then Persia's Iran, and then they came to Iraq, Mesopotamia, and Babylon, and then they came into Arabia. And then the Roman historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, they all talk about the Magi. The book of Daniel describes the Magi. A Roman historian, I think, tells us Magi visited Nero in AD 66. They were very well known. They were like royal fortune tellers. They went around telling people's fortunes. They were giving gifts, no doubt, to do this. And Josephus tells us that Magi visited Herod in about 10 BC. So they were astronomers and astrologers. They weren't distinguished, those terms, in ancient times. From Arabia, right? Roman fortune tellers. And Matthew simply says, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Matter of fact, why not? Everyone knew about them. Why do you need to say more? And people knew they were from the east, because Arabia, Iraq, and Iran are all from the east. So it wouldn't appear at all unusual to Matthew and his audience. So I think Rowan Williams hasn't, in this particular case, done his studies very accurately. And then Rowan Williams goes on to say this: as for the star rising and standing still, the Archbishop pointed out that stars just don't behave like that. And then Ruth Gledhill, who was the religious correspondent of the Times, maybe still is, said Dr. Williams was not saying anything that is not taught as a matter of course in even the most conservative theological colleges. So let's just look very quickly, because I'm aware that time's rushing on. Is it true that you can't have a star rising and standing still? well, you can certainly have a star rising, because stars rise every evening when they appear above the horizon. But the star standing still is an apparent problem. But let's say it's not only distinguished Anglican archbishops who can make mistakes. This is a very distinguished Catholic writer, wrote 2 volumes of Birth of Messiahs, very scholarly works, and he says there's an insuperable obstacle to believing in the Star of Bethlehem. A star that rose in the east, appeared over Jerusalem, turned south to Bethlehem, and then came to rest over a house, would have constituted a celestial phenomenon unparalleled in astronomical history, yet it received no notice in the records of the times. So it's one of these beautifully phrased statements which looks very plausible. Just to get the geography right, is saying a star that rose in the east, because the Matthew story says that the star was seen in the east first of all, appeared over Jerusalem. I don't think the Gospels say that. Turned south to Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is due south of Jerusalem, and then came to rest over a house. So what the Gospels do, what Matthew's Gospel does say, is that the star was seen in the east. The Magi went to Jerusalem because they believed the significance of maybe the star and other events meant that the new king of the Jews would be born. That's why they went to Jerusalem. Then Herod, the wise men of Herod told them to go to Bethlehem, because the Old Testament said that's where the Messiah would be born. So they went to Bethlehem, and they saw then the star ahead of them, so the star was then south of them. And then the Gospels say that it stood over the place where Christ was born. So I won't go through the details because there's not time, so I'm simplifying the story. The only celestial possibility is a comet. I think there's no other celestial possibility. It can be very bright. Matthew says Herod ascertained from the Magi the exact time the star appeared, so it's a newly appeared star, which is what a comet is. It suddenly appears in the sky when you can see it. Comets move through the sky against the night background at 1 to 2 degrees per day, so they can travel 90 degrees through the sky against the star background. They can go east to south. It's a known comet orbit, so that's astronomically very valid, and it will take 1 to 2 months to do this, which will be the journey time of the Magi. So the difficult point is that the star went ahead of them and stood over the place where the child was. And if you interpret this broadly, it would be Bethlehem. If you interpret it less broadly, it might be a particular house. But broad interpretation could be fine. But it's still difficult. How can a star stand over a place? Well, it's interesting. I hunted in ancient literature, and I found that other literature used this phrase for a star standing over a place. Dio Cassius, writing a Roman history, said a star called Comet, so he identifies it, we now know it's Halley's Comet, stood for several days over the city. That was Rome. So he's saying the star stood over Rome. And Josephus, in Jewish War, says a star resembling a sword stood over the city, and long-tailed comets looked like swords with a curved sword blade. And so swords was a frequent description of a long-tailed comet, and so that would have been a comet. So, and he says it stood over the city, that being Jerusalem, and if you do the dating, AD 64. So only reference I find, and they both say stood over. So when Matthew talks about a star standing over a place, then the only thing he can be referring to is a comet, and other people, Dio Cassius and Joseph, have used exactly the same description of what a comet does. And this, we haven't, in my lifetime, we have not had a comet with a long tail. This is Donatus' comet over Paris in 1858, and you can see how a star can stand over a place. So here's the comet, and the head of the comet is apparently sort of pointed by this long curved tail to Paris. So you would say that star is standing over Paris, and you could even say that star is standing over a particular building. Of course, it depends where you are, right? But these people are walking along this road to going due south to Bethlehem, and they would see the star standing over a place. If they're somewhere else, they'll see it standing over a different place, right? And the comet's low on the horizon. And there's a lovely drawing of Isaac Newton, a comet standing over King's College Chapel. I should have put that in, but I missed it out to shorten things. So when Raymond Brown describes and saying this is unparalleled, this is not true. The description we have in Matthew's Gospel is of a possible known star, comet. And yet it received no notice in the records of the times. That is not true, so Raymond Brown hadn't done his homework. Here's a record of the times. It's the Han Shu, the record of the Chinese astronomers in the Han Dynasty, and if you translate it, they refer to this star, a comet in 5 BC, and this is what it says in the Chinese records. This is when it appeared. And unusually, there's a footnote in the Chinese records. This really is unusual. It just normally just records the star. And the footnote says, Sui, that's a long-tail comet, are the means of eliminating the old and inaugurating the new. Chu, that's a place in the sky. It's a place where the 5 planets arise and so on. Then it says the appearance of the Sui was a sign of change. The long period of its appearance, because it appeared for over 70 days according to the Chinese records, was an indication of the importance of the instant to come. So this was the interpretation of the Chinese astronomers, stroke astrologers of this event, and these interpretations tend to be quite widespread in the ancient world. So this had great significance for the Chinese, but it's a rather interesting idea of eliminating the old and inaugurating the new, which many would say the birth of Christ did. So let me go on rapidly. And so this is also interesting. The earliest reference to what this star was the 3rd century scholar Origen, who says, the star that was seen in the east we consider to be a new star such as a comet. And that's the earliest reference we have to what the star was. So a comet really does fit rather well. This isn't evidence at all, it's just an interesting observation that Giotto, in his nativity painting, has a comet there as a star of Bethlehem. So, and there's just another clue. This comet appeared in the spring. Luke says shepherds are living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And in Bethlehem, because it snows there frequently, we know today, and we have records in the past, the sheep were not kept in the fields in December, January, February. So it's extremely unlikely the shepherds would have been out there, and they're not there now. The sheep are actually kept inside, and the shepherds stay inside as well. And then the sheep are put back out to grass in March to November, and the shepherds are out particularly in the lambing season, March to April, just to protect the lambs, so they can be used for Passover. So this is, I think, the last slide. So what I've tried to do is to take 3 biblical stories which are really challenging and which many scholars, for what seem to be good reasons, think are not factual stories. So we looked at the story of Joseph, the sun stopping, the Star of Bethlehem, and as I say, most scholars think they're legends. The evidence I've put forward, I think, does suggest quite strongly that they are factual stories and historical stories, and this raises our expectations, I suggest, that the rest of the Bible, which is somewhat easier to believe, is reliable. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Well, there's plenty of time for questions, and we have 2 microphones, I think, one on each side. So if you'd like to ask a question, just put your hand up.
My question is about the passage in Joshua that talks about the sun stopping. It actually goes on to say in the middle of the day and delayed going down about a full day. So do eclipses occur for that length of time?
Right, thank you. That's a very, very good question. This was in my original talk, and I shortened it, but I've kept the slides, so we'll go to this. Thank you. Yeah, so there we are. So this is exactly what you read out to us. Thank you. So the book of Joshua also says the sun did not hurry to set for about a whole day. And I'll just tell you this interesting story, because if you go on the internet and look about the sun stopping, what you find is this story on the internet, which at the time a lot of people regarded as a true story. And the story is that someone called Harold Hill was working for a company, and he was a consultant to NASA, and he wandered into this room in NASA, and the computer scientists were all scratching their heads because they said, we've been computing the positions of the sun and the moon in the future, and we've gone back into the past, and we find there's a missing day, and we can't just explain it at all. And Harold Hill said, I can explain it, it's the missing day of Joshua. And so he published a book on this, and there were newspaper headlines. And then NASA issued a press release which said the story is a total invention, there's no missing day, but it became an urban myth. So that's an interesting observation. In case you look on the internet, you may find this. So, right, so this is what I got. I should have said before, probably in the words, I collaborated with an astrophysicist, Graham Waddington, on these calculations, And I asked Graham to calculate the illumination on the ground as the eclipse happened and passed. So this is the level of illumination as a function of time, and it's a time as measured locally on a sundial. This fake curve was just the illumination on the ground just during the afternoon normal sunset. So here's when the sun's setting at almost 6 o'clock. And when we have the eclipse, this is the illumination on the ground. So the illumination drops, and that's when the eclipse is at its maximum, and then it increases again and goes down. And this is a logarithmic scale, so this decrease is actually a factor of 10, or thereabouts. And so what's happening is, you're out on the field, you've got no watches, right? No water clocks are out there, so you don't know what the time is, except you're just watching the illumination of the ground, watching what's happening. And the sun, apparently, this is dust, this is the illumination of dust. So apparently dust comes, and this has been observed in such annular eclipses elsewhere. The birds think it is the end of the day, they start to roost, and it appears to be that the day is ending. And then suddenly the illumination increases again. So this looks as if the day is ending, and then the day is extended because the illumination is increasing again. And so this does suggest, this does, I think, fit very well the idea that the day is apparently lengthened, right? It's not actually lengthened, it's apparently lengthened. And again, if you look at what the Hebrew actually says, and Alan Millard has said a really better translation, I mean, it's just a small change. It says, the sun did not hurry to set as on a whole day, is the actual best Hebrew translation he suggests. So, so as on a whole day. So it's just set, appears to set, and then it comes back again. So I hope that, if you like, there's a double dusk on that day. And there's a first dusk at the maximum of the eclipse, and then the illumination of the ground 10 times less than normal. Birds would have roosted, then the light level rises, the birds stop roosting, and then there's a normal dusk after that. So I think that is, it appeared the day had been lengthened so the Israelites could complete their victory. So thank you.
Is this on? Yes, it is. So how did this eclipse aid Joshua in defeating his enemies? Because there was less light, not more, and there was the same amount of time.
I think it would have aided. Joshua was already winning, right? He was chasing them down this route. I think they would have been terrified by this eclipse, and I think that would have been the final straw. But there's also a hailstorm event is recorded. This would, so this was nature really conspiring to be on the side of Joshua and defeat them.
Okay, so basically the sun did not tarry to set for a whole day. It set at the normal time.
It set at the normal time, but there was an apparent dusk before it set, so it was a double dusk day. Yes.
Okay, I have another comment about the Star of Bethlehem. You said that comets move at about 2 degrees a day. This is against the starry background, but the stars still rise and set during all that time.
Yes.
So when the Bible says that the star stopped over a particular place, it didn't. It was still rotating with all the other stars.
But right, but they were. I think is Bethlehem something like, is it 2 or 5 miles from Jerusalem? It's
I don't know.
No, it is. I mean, it's quite close. I forget now. It's either 2 or 5 miles. But if it's 5 miles, I mean, they would have done this journey in 20 minutes or so, and the comet position wouldn't have moved very much in 20 minutes.
But the Bible said that the star stopped over the house.
The word "stopped" can mean still. So the star was still. Yeah. So sorry. A translation is stood. I mean, it depends what translation you're looking at, but that Hebrew word can mean stopped or stood. So the stood over, and that's the same expression which Joseph has used for a star standing over Jerusalem, and Deo Cassius used for a star standing over. Different languages. For the Roman, but it's the same meaning of the text.
It seems
I think we could continue this over drinks afterwards
Yeah.
To give other people a chance. Just behind you.
Thank you. You seem to be saying that if we study the Bible and original text, that the stories become a lot clearer and a lot more understandable. Now, is that applicable to the very difficult parts of the Bible, like the parting of the Red Sea, Adam and Eve's story, and even the resurrection?
Right. Okay, that's a good question. So, I think the parting of the Red Sea, what the biblical text says is that Moses stretched out his hand over the water, and the Lord sent a strong east wind which blew all night. So the Bible's explicit. This was a natural mechanism. And there is a natural mechanism which is called wind set down. And wind set down is when wind does actually blow water backwards, and shipwrecks are being discovered when you blow back over a sloping tide and a sloping shoreline, and the wind just blows the sea back, and you can see shipwrecks. So, for example, if I won't do it, but it's obvious. If I fill this glass with water and blow across the surface, water blows out of the other side. It's the force of my breath on the water blowing it out. And so this is a strong wind blowing along a stretch of water. Lake Erie, when there's been a strong wind blowing there, the difference in height between one end and the other, the maximum difference has been 16 feet. It's enormous. It quite often is 4 feet. And so, basically, so the natural mechanism for this, and that is that the sea was blown back, dry land, Moses goes across, and then when the wind suddenly stopped, and it's a slow process, so you do need it to blow all night, and you get a steady state situation, what scientists call, and then if the wind suddenly stops, the water comes back as a bore wave, right? It comes back, and so that is sufficient to knock people off their horses. The resurrection, I think, does break all sorts of physical laws, if you're honest. And so,
Well, thank you for being honest.
thank you. Yes. And so God is acting differently there.
I think we do eventually have to accept miracles.
Well, so I would say there are different sorts of miracles, and I would say that the parting of the Red Sea is a miracle because of the timing. It's remarkable timing, but God is then acting with nature, is not breaking any physical laws, I would say, whereas the resurrection, God is breaking physical laws. Do you want to continue about this, or? Well,
Just say a few words. Then
this is very. I find this. This is an analogy I find very helpful. So, let's say, okay. So I find this a helpful analogy. Let's say there's a piano in this room, and you go into the room, and someone's playing a piano, and they're playing it from memory. They've got no music, and you watch their fingers as they go over the keys, and you see that every time they go to play the letter F, they play F sharp. And so if you're a musician, you say, they're playing in the key of G major, if I've got it right. And then that's what scientists do. They look at the universe, they look for these regularities and patterns, and they discover what's called the key signature of the universe, the laws of the universe. And what the composer would have done would have written on the piece of music at the start of each line a little sharp sign against F. But then, if you continue to watch, you may find that the pianist sometimes doesn't play F sharp, they just play F, or they play C sharp, or A flat. And you think, I know what's happened, these are accidentals, right? And if you continue to watch still more, you may find that in a couple of bars there's a whole bunch of accidentals, and so the composer just changes the key signature. But the composer is free to do this because he is the composer. But if he's a really great composer, he'll only do it if it makes better music, if it makes more sense. And so with a resurrection, I mean, the analogy is obvious in the sense, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good analogy, thank you.
I mean, with a resurrection, it makes more sense. If Jesus was the Son of God, it makes more sense that he was risen from the dead than not. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. In the middle of the lecture, you said about the authorship of Moses. And then you said that there's no reason to believe that Moses did not write it. But 19th century scholarship, like Wellhausen's classical documentary hypothesis, and subsequent research has proved that, at least tried to suggest that the Hebrew changes very much in all these books, and the dates are stretched, which means that it was fragments and parts of various texts that were brought together over a period of time. So would you still believe that there was a single authorship? Thank you.
No, thank you very much. That's a good question. No, I don't believe there was a single authorship for the first 5 books of the Bible, and there's one very good reason as well, because they describe the death of Moses, right? So that's a good reason. But I think I don't know is the answer, and I think it's quite likely that there are a number of authors of the Book of Genesis, or maybe there's just one. I think it's hard to know. I think the Wellhausen theory, which was very well believed if you go back 20 or 30 years, scholars are raising major doubts about that now. And so, so that's getting on quite shaky ground. I would say of the Joseph story, it's a very coherent story. It's really quite hard to believe. If you read the story through, the 20 chapters, it just reads like a single author to me. So, I think there's a lot we don't know as well about the Bible, but, we need more scholarship and more evidence. But I would not say it's impossible that Moses wrote some of the first 5 books of the Bible, and if Moses really was brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, he would have been taught to read and write in Pharaoh's palace, and he could have written the 10 Commandments, for example, and other parts of it. So I find that not impossible to believe. Thank you.
Hi, over here. Thank you very much for your talk. I noticed you run out of time towards the end, but could you take us through the evidence of the shepherding patterns in the Star of Bethlehem story that you sort of touched upon towards the end of the presentation?
Sorry, what pattern? Sorry.
The shepherding, so how you might infer the date of the first Christmas from how the sheep was organized in Bethlehem. It was towards the end of your...
Yes, right. Thank you. So I was saying that Luke says that there were shepherds out in the field watching their flocks by night, and in modern day Bethlehem that does not happen because it does cold in winter. It's too cold in winter for both the sheep and the shepherds, and so they're kept indoors. And we have records going back which says that this was the case as well if you go back in time. And when the shepherds would definitely be out in the fields was in the spring lambing season to protect their flocks from foxes and so on. So the spring does make sense. And this comet was visible in the spring. That's what the Chinese records tell us. So again, we have a consistent story emerging that Jesus was actually born in the spring. The date of December the 25th is a late tradition. I now forget how late it is, but it is a late tradition. And many people believe it was based on the Roman feast of Saturnalia, which was held around that time. So, in fact, it was held on that date. So the Romans celebrated the days getting longer. So the shortest day, I think, is December the 21st or 22nd. But to make quite sure the days were getting long, they waited for December the 25th and they held their feast there. And this was Saturnalia, I think Saturnalia, it was the feast of the feast of the wonderful sun or something. I'm now forgetting the term. But I mean, it clearly has symbolism for Christians as well. So that's when the date may have been chosen. But there's very little evidence for this. And I think the spring is quite strong evidence.
Just forward.
Colin,
use the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I think a few years ago on the BBC there was a series of Jeremy Bowen's talks on explaining the plagues of Israel, and there was I just wondered whether the academic scholarship behind all that was well known or whatever, whether you'd gone into that. There was another earthquake somewhere in southern Europe, and all the plagues he explained. I wouldn't say explained away, but obviously the timing, as you say, was the key thing. Do you know whether that was another one of those sort of things that's got academic scholarship behind it? Do you remember the Jeremy Bowen BBC series?
Yes, I saw some of those. I'm not sure about this particular one. What I do know is that quite a distinguished scholar who was called Hort, I forget her Christian name now. She was not Newnham College, Girton College. She first proposed that the plagues were a series of natural events, and one plague sort of led to the other plague. And so, I mean, I'll just start it off, and then I have to finish. But I mean, I think the first plague was the river turning to blood, the Nile turning to blood. And she said this was due to algae blooming. So algae, which are often green or other colours, they can go bright red, certain algae, when they become, and they emit toxins. And they do this when the water temperature is high and when there are nutrients in the water. So when the Nile floods, this is the case, and it's been observed in lots of places in the world. Every year, somewhere there's algae blooms, and they just kill the fish because the toxins which are given off. And what's quite interesting is that the text of Exodus says that I think it was the Israelites, maybe they dug along the banks of the Nile and they could drink the water. So the sand was filtering. The sand was filtering out these algae, right? And so that's a scientific process. And then the next plague, I think, was the plague of, was it frogs next? Or I forget. But anyway, but basically, the stink of this dying fish all stinks, so the frogs leave the Nile and they all come indoors and they go into people's houses and so on. But it's a natural sequence of events, and I think that is very plausible.
But the principle is that it's no less a miracle.
No, that's right.
That all these different things you're saying is no less a miracle of God.
That's right. And that's right. And not only that, these are 10 plagues. If you interchange 2 of these plagues, then that sequence is broken. So this suggests that these 10 plagues are actually recorded in the correct order. If you accept it as a sequence of natural events, and Hort's explanation is very good. I mean, I wrote a book called The Miracles of Exodus, and I just sort of update some of her explanations in places. But if you just interchange 2 of these plagues, then that natural sequence is lost. And it's a really quite strong argument to be a natural sequence.
I think we'll take one very last quick question because some people will have to leave, I know. So perhaps we can have one quick question and
yes,
quick answer.
Thank you, Colin. You mentioned earlier about the dating of Joshua from the tree rings from 1600 BC. How can you get that degree of precision on the dates from the dating of tree rings? And cause there aren't any trees 3,500 years old, presumably, that you can count that number of trees. So how does that work? Can you explain?
Let's ask Bob to tell you about the age of trees.
There's bristlecone pines in California that are 4,500 years old. But the way you do it is you find a tree which is living and you just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you find a tree that's a bit older which has died. And because the patterns are not regular, you can match up the patterns on the living tree, the outer bit with the inner bit of the next tree. And that takes you back another distance. Then you find another dead tree that overlaps that one. And you can go back, to about 8,000 years that way. Just counting.